Thousands have taken to the streets in the Georgian capital of Tbilisi to protest the government's proposed foreign agent law. Georgia's ruling party first attempted to pass a controversial bill on, quote, foreign agents in March of 2023. The law would have required civil society groups and the media to register as being, quote, under foreign influence if they receive funding from abroad. But human rights and pro-democracy activists are worried that the country is on the first step of the road to repression. Joining us now to discuss the protests and joining us from Georgia is politician Zurab Japaridze. Zurab, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
But we know that this isn't the first time the government has proposed this law. But in your view, what are the major issues with the law?
Yes, it's the second time they are doing it. They did it last year in March, and we had quite a large number of people also protesting. And then they had to take it back. And then they publicly promised that they will not do it again ever. But just a couple of weeks ago, they announced that they want to reintroduce this law and they want to adopt it. And again, we have protests now on the streets. The problem with this law is that basically, if this law is adopted, be the beginning of the end of the civil society and critical media in this country. And we know how it works. We've seen it how it was done in Russia. Now Kyrgyzstan is doing it. Slovakia is doing it. And we know that it's kind of a new wave coming from Kremlin of this kind of attack on civil society and critical media that gets some funding from the Western foundations and international organizations.
And you mentioned the Kremlin, and a lot of outsiders have described, and people within Georgia, have described this law as being pro-Russian. Can you explain to us why it's perceived as a pro-Russian law?
We call it actually a Russian law. So it's one of our messages. It's been used by all the political parties, opposition political parties, or the whole civil society organizations or critical media, that this is a Russian law. Why? Because we know that in Russia, they also adopted a number of years ago exactly the similar law. It was called foreign agent law. They got civil society organizations registered as a foreign agent, and then they build up on this law different types of regulations. And finally, after a couple of years, we see the reality in Russia where they have no civil society organizations, there is no critical media, and we know that we are on this path. So we don't want to follow on this path because we are a candidate country for EU membership, and over 80% of Georgia population supports EU integration. Over 80% of Georgia population wants EU to become full member of the European Union. So it's a completely different path. So this is why we call this law Russian law.
And when we call it a Russian law, is there also the implication that there is Russian involvement in the continued push for this law? Is there evidence that the Kremlin is exerting influence on the government in Georgia to make sure or to push for this law to be passed?
Yes, unfortunately, we believe that this is a reality. We cannot actually provide any proof that somebody is calling from Kremlin to Ivanishvili, the Georgian oligarch who is basically in charge of all this country, or the prime minister. We cannot provide this kind of proof, but the steps we see this current government is making, all these steps are pro-Russian steps. As I already mentioned, Georgia became a candidate country for EU membership last year, December. We need to implement the so-called 9 points that were set for Georgia by the European Commission. We have to deal with the reforms in judiciary, in electoral system, fight corruption, and de-oligarchize the country. And instead of implementing these kind of reforms, they introduce this Russian law. And we have been, for number of weeks now, we hear from basically all the Western institutions, also from Europe, all the European institutions, if this law is adopted, it's going to be the end of Georgia's EU integration, or at least this process will be prolonged for a very long time. So we just looked at the steps what they're making, and we see that these steps are pro-Russian, or are in the interest of Russia. And this is why we call this law Russian law.
Do you think that the push for the law is then an attempt to try and ruin that effort to join the EU?
We believe so. Yes, we believe so. I mean, the problem the current government has is that, as I've already mentioned, more than 80% of people throughout the tens of years, any poll that anyone can look says that these people are for EU and for NATO integration. So they cannot go public and say that we are pro-Russian. I mean, any government will end its governance as soon as they say it. So they have to play somehow that they are also pro-Western, pro-European. They are trying to say that they have some kind of balanced politics.
I want you to hold that thought, and we're back. We're talking about the protests in Georgia over a proposed foreign agent law. Zurab, before the break, we were talking about the implications of Georgia wanting to join the EU, the impact this will have on civil society. For a lot of Canadians, they may not be familiar with the political circumstances in Georgia right now. And so what do you see as what will happen next if this law is passed, specifically for individuals like yourself or those who are on the streets urging for Georgia to enact on the public will and continue those steps to join the EU? Are there threats of arrests, arresting activists and journalists or dissidents, those whom you're associated with?
Yes, it's difficult to give a precise answer what's going to happen. But what I can say is that if this law is adopted, the major civil society organizations most probably will refuse to get registered as a foreign agent. This means that we might have no monitoring from the local observers during the October parliamentary elections, and we have a parliamentary elections on 26th of October, which is like a crucial point for this country. So it is a huge problem, and we all understand that it's a huge protest. This is why we have lots of people every evening on Main Avenue in Tbilisi, in the capital of Georgia. We already seen arrests. I just came back from one of the court hearings where one of my colleagues was fined by a huge amount of money. We are used to it. We've been arrested many times. We've been fined many times. We have special task forces of the police that beat us up. They use paper sprays and whatever for no reason, because all these protests are peaceful protests. We do not destroy anything. We do not attack anyone. We just protest. But still, they use harsh methods, to put it mildly, to somehow intimidate people, because the only force that can stop them is lots of people on the street. So they do whatever they deem necessary to intimidate people so that people don't go and not protest. But as I said, they cannot stop it, because people understand that for their children's future, it's better Georgia to be member of the European Union and not to be some kind of periphery of a Russian, modern Russia or something like this. So this is why people still go out. We have demonstrations not only in Tbilisi, but also in some other major cities in Georgia. We believe that we can stop them, because we stopped them last year. If we not manage to stop them, and there will be some repressions against politicians or civil society leaders, etc., still we will get to the elections in October, and we are quite positive we will win these elections.
Yeah, and I guess what will it take for this law to be stopped like it was before? Is it just simply a matter of public pressure and demonstration? And what are you confident that those who are protesting are going to be able to keep this up and continue to put pressure on the government to not push forward with this law?
Yes, unfortunately, this is the first time in the history of newly independent Georgia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where we have the government that not only does not care about the recommendations or suggestions coming from the Western institutions, but they are running anti-Western propaganda. So this is quite a new situation even for us. We had political parties in power that wanted to stay in power and did some bad stuff. But this is the first time when we have a government that actually runs anti-Western propaganda. So for previous governments, when there were messages coming from the European Union, from the European Council, or even from Washington, D.C., saying that you need to do some reforms in judiciary, you need to do some reforms in election systems, you need to democratize your country, you need to get rid of your oligarch and things like that, it was some kind of a pressure, outside leverage used by our friends from the West, and those governments were more inclined to maybe not comply like 100%, but at least do something. But with this government, we have a first time a reality where they just don't care. So the only leverage we as citizens of this country have now is lots of people out in the streets protesting and demanding this law to be taken back. And last year we managed to do, because there were so many people and they persistently stayed on this main avenue of Rustavelli, and then the government realized that they cannot do it and they took it back. Now we are protesting for more than 10 years, 10 days already, and we have lots of young people out on Rustavelli Avenue, the main avenue in Tbilisi, and they say that they will not stop. We know that political parties will not stop. We know also from civil society organizations that they don't intend to stop. So we are hopeful that they will take it back. If not, as I said, this is the war, the battle is not over. We will continue it, and then in October we have elections and we will change this government.
Zurab, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your interest.